We've got plenty of time for questions this morning. Thanks a lot for 3 great talks. That was really wonderful. There's a couple of microphones here. If you have a question, if you go to the mic, because I'm moderator, I get to ask the first question. And I have kind of a 2-part question. First is for Kurt. When you talked about establishing your means and your groups for instruments, you talked about picking your group and something about that they should be switching to new lots of reagent at the same time, right? And I don't know any of us that switch all your instruments to a new lot at the same time. It might be within a week or 2 of each other, but we don't like change them all at the same time. So A, is that a problem? And then my second part of my question is really, I get the idea that the more instruments you have, the idea of a single mean, but with that concept, why can't I use peer mean, the peer mean? Because it seems like they've got even more, a larger N. So 2-part question. Use the mic.
So for the first one, the point about changing over QC lots and reagent lots at the same time, keeping them in sync, is the assumption being that reagent lot change or a QC lot change changes the QC means. So you don't want to be mixing, you don't want to be grouping 2 instruments that are truly expected to have different QC means, either because of a reagent lot change or QC lot change.
But we don't change our QC mean with every lot change of reagent.
And that will depend upon whether or not there's any evidence that a reagent lot change adversely affects the QC mean. Yeah.
True
so,
enough.
And that's knowledge
Without
that.
changing
Yeah.
the patient.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So,
Okay.
I know that there have been studies that show that reagent lot change can have in the CLSI document, that reagent lot change can have might not be expected to have an impact on patient results, but because of non-commutability, can have an effect on. And in those situations where there's evidence that the reagent lot change should require you to change your QC mean, then you wouldn't want to keep those in the same group. If you've decided you don't need to, then it would be okay. So that's part 1. Part 2, the issue of what you set your fixed mean to, the case I took was all the instruments in a particular hospital laboratory, or instruments controlled by a laboratory where they, from the patient's perspective, they're one instrument. The performance of that analytical system is really what the mean expectation is, the mean of that whole group, and any differences between individual instruments are then are biases. But the reference point that you're using, the thing that you're considering the correct value that you want to get, is that group mean. Now, the other poster that I didn't talk about actually deals with the case of, is it better to set your instrument's QC target to the instrument mean or a reference mean? So the case I just talked about, the group mean for your lab, is what we're considering the reference mean. If indeed you believe that the target, the reference that you really want to consider as your unbiased goal, is a peer group mean, and by all means use that. But then you have to recognize that there's the possibility that your individual instruments and their overall mean is different from that peer mean. And what you're then saying is that my goal is not the overall mean of my instruments. My goal is that peer group mean, and now that's going to be an additional amount of bias.
Yeah.
There will be an additional amount of bias in terms of what you're considering an erroneous result. Yeah. But that might be what you want to use, and that's okay, and you can design that way. Right. Then, indeed, what that other poster shows is that you're better to use your peer group mean if you consider that your reference mean than you are your group mean. That would be the better thing to use.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Questions from the audience? Seriously, no questions? You all are good with your QC? Oh, we got one question here.
Randy Young from LabCorp, just confirming, Kurt, our discussion years ago that my memory is the same as yours. So
my big concern was I was going to give you more credit than you deserve for the things that you said. But
I welcome that a lot. I appreciate it. I don't get that at home, so it's good. I will say that while we had group means and instruments per lab, it wasn't the whole country. It was at different group, to your point about patient population. So
Right.
Tampa had their group and Burlington had theirs. So, but now, because of the Unity Real-Time and the powerful software that we have individual instrument means, and we're able to control the whole country from a command center. So we don't have to argue about target values based on cumulative data or what rules to use. So, our concept is to standardize total allowable error, and what rule or range you need to use is important there. So is different. So, but I thank you for your great talk, and again, we're growing old together, so our memories are very much the same, I think. Thank you very much.
Additional questions? I have one for John. So you talked about establishing your mean, and then your new mean in a crossover study, and that at some point kind of re-examining that, right? Is there a point, oh, sorry, this is for Nico. Yeah, I said John, I'm looking at Nico. Is there a certain amount of time after which you recommend actually taking a look at your how you're running?
Yeah, that's a good question. Depends a little bit already on how much data points you collect. So if you're running multiple QCs a day, you might already have, like, even after a week, more data to take a look at it. I would say it probably is the easiest if you include it in your QC revision when you're doing like a bi-weekly or a monthly meeting to go and take a look at it. Might also be something that you already noticed, that people in the lab start telling you that there's more rejections going on, that they get more flags, and they're like, hey, we're not sure if this is really well established. Maybe that could already give you an indication. There is no real number in there. I think in the beginning I tried to say let's look at it after like 30 days or 30 or 40 more points. I don't know, Curtis, I was gonna throw it to you because I know you have a magic number, I think.
Yeah, so we made this was an area that was discussed quite a lot in the C24 committee with the new revision, and the important points that we made were that 10 data points over 10 individual separate days was adequate to get an initial estimate. Not the perfect estimate, but an initial estimate that couldn't cause too much problems. The big concern, the way we determined what adequate meant, was how much could our false rejection rate change because we've done a poor job of estimating the target. And as long as it couldn't make our false rejection rate be too severely different from what we would expect, we thought it was okay, and 10 data points was fine. But then we recognized that in 10 data points, not only is there's more imprecision there will be for a larger number, but also there's a good chance that we're not capturing some of those long-term sources of variability that just don't express themselves in 10 days. So the recommendation was, when you've acquired enough data so that the N's larger and you've experienced some of those other possible long-term sources of variation, like preventive maintenance or calibrations or stuff, and that, depending on the particular measurement procedure, that might be 30 days, that might be 60 days, that might be 90 days, it might be a month, it might. But at some point, based on your knowledge of what those other sources of variability are, update that mean, because now you've got a larger sample size, you've incorporated more of those sources of variability. Update it once. Again, as Nico said, not every week or every 30 days, but update it once, consider that now your good mean, and then don't consider changing at that point unless you have some evidence that something truly has changed that caused the mean to change.
Yeah. Okay. Question?
Good morning. Thank you for beautiful presentation. Really, we need this kind of presentation to help us with day-to-day job we have. I have two questions regarding two problems that I had. First of all, few weeks ago, I got a phone call from BioRed that they said that my data will be rejected due to cumulative data doesn't match with what I'm reporting. And then obviously I had problem with the assay, so what I was doing is my regular routine. You do, you call the manufacturer, you do the lot cross, because we changed to a new calibrator. So I consider everything, check the instrument, make sure instrument is good. And I went through the 3 of the, corrective action. And then I felt very good to adjust my mean, and the cumulative mean was 21. Then I came to 15. And then I was checking peer group, instant QC, they were doing the same thing, that I felt so good that everything is fine. And in reality, things were good. The only problem I had, because the assay is so low volume, we have like 2 samples per month, I could not do patient sample. But with everything else, checking this, checking that, I felt comfortable. I couldn't really understand why cumulative had effect on my rejecting my data. So eventually the resolution was establish, configure a new test with the new calibrator and go on with your life. And we did. I couldn't understand this concept. How do you guys correlate cumulative results from months ago with the rejection of new data when the mean suddenly changes? The other question I have an assay which is very hard to make the QC work because it's latex-based, and low-level QC, which is should be normal range of a patient, never comes, just suddenly comes. And each corrective action takes 40 minutes of the time. We tried with Bio-Rad for different sets of QC, very, very low, medium, and high. And then very, very low had problem. Then we went medium and high. Medium is having problem. At some point, I usually make my adjustment based on CV. I have CV this for each test, and then I make a standard deviation. How far I can go with CV? Right now I have CV of 8 to 10 on this assay. But I saw in some report that up to 41 for this specific assay is good. Where is the limit? How can I adjust? Right now I just reject, do troubleshooting. Everybody, asks me all the time, will you change the assay? Because of some problems that we cannot change assay. So I just make sure it's very tight so I don't get in trouble with patient. But it really causes a lot of work. So what should I do?
Well, I can take the first one. Easy.
Would you want to repeat the question as you understand it?
Well, that was a while ago. So the first part, like rejection of data. So the Interlab program, we protect it by statistical outliering. And what you were saying is that if you saw a change with a new calibrator lot, so if those differences are too big according to the existing peer group, and it's actually 4 standard deviations for low results and 3 standard deviations for results higher than 5, Unity or the Unity Interlab program will reject your data. Because otherwise, the peer group will be polluted and will have a very high variation, and the target is not really that precise anymore. So what you've probably heard is that they've advised you to make a new test with a new calibrator as a reagent to separate those 2 groups, to try to make those 2 groups different. At this time, in our Interlab program, reagent lots and calibrator lots are still all part of one peer group. We are working towards the future to also start splitting up the peer groups based upon reagent lots and even calibrator lots, but we're not there yet at this time. So that's why you probably are getting your rejection, because it is looking at the old data, the previous month data, and rejecting your data based upon that. I'm always happy to take a look exactly at what the test was, and then I can also follow up with our technical group to see why exactly that rejection happened. But that, most of the time, it is just to protect the peer groups, because if there is a big significant shift, then that would mess up the peer groups for everybody. And now we're trying to put you in a new group, you might be one of the first labs starting with that new calibrator lot. And that might change, and you might see that more people come in and will confirm your target change.
Okay, good,
And
thank you.
then we're running out of time, but if someone can tackle the second question, which as I understood it was you're having difficulty getting your QC in, it's got a wide CV, is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
Someone want to quickly take that?
So the first thing is that you want to take a look at what does the test method, how is your test method performing compared to the other people who have that test method? One of the best ways to do that is with our statistical profile report. And you can see exactly where you fall, what percentile you are compared to everybody else. And that'll give you some guidance on what would you expect. So if, everybody is out there at 20 and you're at 9, you're doing great, right? And vice versa, you would be concerned if 95% of the labs are at 8 and you're at 20. So having said that, I think what you really need to do is take a look at, so first make sure that with respect to the state of the art, that you feel comfortable with your performance. That's the first thing. Then the second is that you need to really take a look at what kind of quality specification are you using, and does it correspond to the performance that you're actually producing? So one way that you can do that is by looking at your sigma metrics. And so kind of as we saw earlier, if you have sigma metrics of basically less than 4, it's a big problem. And one thing to look at is to reassess, is your quality specification actually appropriate for your performance? Because what we have to remember is that QC does not improve performance in terms of in the in-control state. The more QC you do, that doesn't change the performance. It's only telling you if there has been a change in performance. And so when you're in the in-control state, you need to design a strategy that would be appropriate for that. I hope that helps. I would be happy to have a longer discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Thanks for coming out this morning. Please join me in thanking the speakers this morning for 3 great talks.